All right, welcome back, everybody, to Sports Bash 97.3 ESPN. As we saw last night, a dominant performance by the Wizards as they absolutely destroy the Indiana Pacers. And now they will face the Philadelphia 76ers. As we know, Paul Hudrick is with us here. And, Paul, it's inside the Sixers. And we know the Sixers have swept the Wizards this year. But you watched that game last night, and that's the kind of game – if that's the kind of game you get, can the Sixers play a game where they got to score in the 140s, which is normal for Washington? So can the Sixers score 135 and win 135, 131, or 142 to 138? Like, is that the kind of game that the Sixers can win?
They can win it against the Wizards because they could score 140 points on the Washington Wizards. That I feel pretty confident in saying. And listen, they've been a better team, flat out. The Washington, as you mentioned, the Sixers swept them, and for the most part handled them. But this team is different. They have played much better down the stretch. Russell Westbrook has really come alive. They've just been a better team. They have been playing better defense, but they're still not a good defensive team. We saw like a guy like Daniel Gafford. Yeah, he's really he's fun. He's athletic. He can block a ton of shots. But, Joel Embiid's going to be a great neutralizer for that. Even Dwight Howard to an extent, just his experience over a guy like a Gafford. And I think that's where they're going to, that's where the Sixers really, yes, you have, first of all, Joel Embiid, Ben Simmons, Tobias Harris, you have that trio that can kind of combat the Bradley Beal, Russell Westbrook duo. Then after that, the Sixers supporting cast, I think, is just much, much better. Again, guys like Ish Smith, Howell Neto, they've had a nice stretch here. They played some good basketball, but they're not Danny Green or Seth Curry, or Matisse Thybulle. They're not to the level of those kind of guys. And I just think George Hill, who I didn't even mention, but when you're going over a 7-game series or best of 7 series, I should say, I do think the Sixers will definitely be able to score enough points because of the players they have and the players that Washington just frankly doesn't have.
Yeah, that seems to be one of the biggest, things is, wow, they score a lot of points. I think you make a good point. The Sixers also prevent a lot of points. They're the best defensive team probably on this side of the bracket. I guess we'll start with kind of go down the matchups here, Paul. You got Alex Len, Lopez, and Gafford. Can they slow down Embiid? Embiid scored 90 points in the 3 games against them, but can they defend him differently? Can they do something to slow him down?
I imagine it's going to be double team. I think if you're a coach and you play against the Sixers and you don't double team, you should probably lose your job. Like that's where we're at with Joel Embiid, especially if you don't have, with all due respect to the 3 guys you mentioned, if you don't have a guy who just is a horse who's just had really good experience against Joel Embiid, whether it is, even this year we saw Marc Gasol, the Lakers double teamed when they went up against the Sixers and Marc Gasol. But yeah, I think you see what works best against Embiid. You see what the Toronto Raptors do when they don't have a big man that's really a prominent defender. Is you just confuse him. You confuse him the best you can. You throw double teams at him. You throw weird exotic stuff at him, and that's your best bet to beating him. So when you're looking at Joel Embiid in the context of, can any of these guys slow him down? No, none of them can. Not even close. So what's gonna be the factor is how good Washington's double teams are, how good their help defense is, how good their rotations are, and then for the Sixers, how good how much the supporting staff, the supporting cast makes the Wizards pay, which again I think they can do when you're looking at the rest of this Wizard personnel. I don't think they can match up well enough that they can afford to double team Joel Embiid and not get burned by the other 4 guys on the floor.
All right, Paul Hudrick, Inside the Sixers, at Paul Hudrick on Twitter. All right, Paul. So there's a bunch of other things, man. This matchup, last night during Inside the NBA, Barkley said, look, I'm just going to make Simmons shoot, which we know he's not going to do. What can Washington do, though, to kind of say, is that a smart way to go? Ben Simmons, you beat us. And is that something that you see happening with this Washington personnel?
Well, I'll say it is a smart strategy because I think that's the best way to defend him is just to give him a ton of space, dare him to shoot, or dare him to make a play off the ball. But then again, it goes back to just not having the personnel to deploy that kind of strategy. Yeah, you could do that if you're the Miami Heat and you have Bam Adebayo and you have Bam Adebayo playing off him a mile, and then when he comes at Bam at the rim, Bam can play defense on it. But who does Washington have on that roster that you can say, okay, you guard Ben Simmons, you give him a ton of space, and just and let him get to the kind of take him on at the rim? Which player on this, like, is Rui Hachimura going to do that? Because I don't think that's going to be the case. I think if that's what you're depending on, if that's the game plan, is for Hachimura to defend Ben Simmons and give him space and then challenge him at the rim, I don't think that ends well for Washington. And in that case, let's say you do that and you have Hachimura guarding Ben Simmons, then who's going to guard Tobias Harris? Because do you think Hachimura would be the better matchup for him? So I just think there's just for Washington, there is no matchup that is going to favor them when they have to match up against the Sixers defensively and the Sixers are on offense. I don't see any favorable matchups for them. Yes, Bradley Beal and Russell Westbrook, they are all-star caliber players, but they're not elite defenders, and so they're going to have to guard people too. And I don't see who on Washington's roster defensively scares me enough that I think that there is a strategy, because that's what it is. Like, at the end of the day, players win these games. It's not coaches' strategies. Yes, they help, and they can help you win games, but you have to have the personnel in order to make these things work. And I just don't see the Wizards having the type of player that can do that to Ben Simmons, that can just take him out. Now, as we get further along, are there teams that can do that? Yes, I think so. Maybe even the New York Knicks could do that, but I don't think the Wizards are the team that can make that happen.
All right, Paul, give me in your mind, when they tip off Sunday at 1:00, when they man-to-man, who's where?
It's going to be tricky because I would think that you would want Ben Simmons on Bradley Beal to start. That would be my thought. And then from there, I guess you have to go Danny Green on Westbrook, which isn't, if I'm being frank, isn't necessarily a great matchup because Westbrook is really explosive. And Danny Green has struggled at times with players that are a little bit more explosive. Now, with the thing with Russell Westbrook is you can also play way off of him when you're talking about, you talk about Ben Simmons guarding him like that. That is also how you guard Russell Westbrook. He's, of course, more willing to shoot, and he might hit the occasional one, but that's still the best strategy to guard him. You play under him, you play under screens, you let him you dare him to take that outside shot. And I think Danny Green, just with his veteran savvy, his experience, I think he can handle that matchup and do pretty well in it. And you have Matisse Thybulle coming off the bench, who I think that'll kind of be lights out for, with Simmons and Matisse Thybulle on the floor against Westbrook and Beal. I mean, that's going to be really tough for Washington. Other than that, yeah, I mean, if they go small and they go like three guards and they start Howell Neto or Ish Smith, that benefits the Sixers because that's who you can put Seth Curry on and kind of hide him. And then match up the other guys, as we said, the big on Embiid, obviously, if that's Len to start games, who obviously doesn't play a ton, but he gets the starts. And then Hachimura probably on, Tobias Harris on Hachimura on the defensive end. So I think that the Wizards' small lineup is actually going to benefit the Sixers with, like I said, with Seth Curry having the guard of Howell Neto or an Ish Smith. And then, Westbrook, could he maybe take advantage of that matchup against Danny Green? I think it's possible, but I think ultimately the Sixers match up extremely well defensively against this team, really 1 through 5.
Okay, so then a lot of teams, it's regular season. We're doing this for regular season, but when the playoffs, things change. Does something change for the Sixers in the playoffs?
I think their defense goes up another notch. I think that 100% happens. I think what you saw, I mean, they were second in net rating, I think, this season they finished. I could see them, upping the ante on that a little bit more. I think the playoffs will, the one thing they've struggled with, and it's been talked about already in these availabilities at their practice, is the transition defense. I think that week off to kind of sort out those issues will be huge. And clearly health, it'll be a huge factor as well. But I also think that in the playoffs, we all see the playoffs are a half-court game. They are not a run up and down transition kind of game. So that will also benefit the Sixers a little bit, I think. But yeah, offensively, if I'm being honest, not in this series, because I don't think the Washington Wizards, as we talked about, have the personnel to stop them. But as the playoffs go along, I am, of course, curious to see the half-court offense, how that's going to look when they play really good defensive teams when they overly aggressively, double team Joel Embiid, triple team Joel Embiid, and dared Ben Simmons to beat them. And the other, and Danny Green and Seth Curry, they're going to be open. They're going to get their looks. Do they take advantage of that? So I think that's going to be the bigger test going forward. But for this series, I just see the Sixers really ramping up their defense in a big way. I think, like as I mentioned, the week off is really going to help them from a health standpoint to get healed and get right. I would imagine early on the Wizards are going to just have more intensity just from playing these games. They essentially already played 2 playoff games, so they're already going to kind of be heightened. So I would expect the Sixers to possibly get off to kind of a slow start in game 1, but I don't think ultimately in the series that's going to be as big of a factor. And I do think ultimately the Sixers defense is going to be too much for the Wizards.
If there's a change, Paul, is it minutes based? In other words, do we see more Thibault? I feel like all of these matchups in the playoffs almost call for better defensive players, more defenders. So I don't know. Is that the change, that maybe the minutes are dispersed differently, or do they say, nope, this is what got us here? Curry, Green, you start, you play your 30 minutes. Thibault, Hill, Shake, we'll get you your minutes as we deem necessary.
I think you're going to see differences for sure, and I think some of it's going to be matchup based, even in-game adjustment based, depending on what's going on, in whatever game we're talking about. I do see, first and foremost, you're going to have the big trio is going to get their minutes extended. Joel Embiid, Ben Simmons, Tobias Harris. They're all going to be probably in that 36 to 40 range. All 3 of those guys, I would imagine, with maybe right. Ben and Tobias closer to the 40 minutes, and Joel maybe hovering 36 to 38. I think Danny Green plays at least 30 minutes because of how good he's been this year. I think he's kind of earned that. With Seth, I'm not as sure. I'm curious to see how Doc does that, because we've seen times this year where Seth Curry, either it's an unwillingness to shoot, or on the defensive end of the floor, he really, getting exposed a little bit by some of these more physical guards, physical players. So I do think his minutes could fluctuate a little bit. And yeah, Mike, I do think Matisse Thybulle, again, depending on the matchup, if there is a guard or a wing that that is giving them particular problems, or that, you put Thybulle in the game and he just happens to do really well. Let's say, for instance, on Bradley Beal, which we did see actually in that third game, Bradley Beal really did struggle against Matisse Thybulle. So if that carries over, yeah, for sure, I could see Doc kind of riding Matisse maybe a little bit more than he would have in the regular season. And what I'm hoping for with Doc Rivers, and I don't know it yet, because this is probably one of my biggest concerns, because we've seen, last year Doc Rivers kind of, being a little rigid and wanting to stick to what kind of, like, to what you said earlier, to what got him here. I want to see him, make adjustments, and I want to see him say, you know what, Shake Milton doesn't have it tonight. I'm going to give Tyrese Maxey a shot and see if I can get some energy. Like, I want to see if he does some of that kind of thing, because I think that's going to be the ultimate test to see if Doc Rivers will be able to get this team farther than they've gone in the past. So I do expect minutes to be different. And I think, like I said, a lot of it, I'm hoping and thinking it'll be matchup based. And the starting 5 will get a lot of minutes. But I think if anyone is at threat to lose minutes, it's Seth Curry.
That'll be interesting, definitely, to see how, as we mentioned, and again, how deep they go. We've talked about that a little bit leading in, but he said, 11 guys. Korkmaz, he's another guy. How much time does he get in these situations? Do we see Mike Scott? We know that Dwight Howard is probably going to have his minutes cut a little bit because Joel and the starters will play more. But how many guys deep does he go? Is interesting. I guess if you watched that game last night, we talked a little bit about this, but the Wizards didn't seem too interested in winning that game. Was it because they didn't seem interested? They'd rather play the Sixers. They just didn't have it. I mean, there's a team that's won, 18 out of the last 24 games. Westbrook talked about it last night, Paul. Literally, what were they, like 17-30 and finished like 17 out of they won 17-6. They had COVID issues. They had injury issues. You look at their record, 34-38. Are they just an average team, or is this a better team than their record suggests they are? In other words, if they were healthy and played a normal year with this group, are they an 8 seed, or are they maybe a 4 or 5 seed?
I still think I kind of think they are who they are to an extent. I think it's a mirror of Russell Westbrook, who can run kind of hot and cold. And when he's hot, he can kind of help carry that team. And when he's cold, they really struggle because Bradley Beal just doesn't have that running mate. And I think that's the main thing when I look at the Wizards. I just see them as they're hot right now. That's what it is. They got very hot. And listen, I understand they had COVID issues, they had injury issues, but listen, so did every other team in the NBA. And I also think that's part of, the second half of the schedule. We saw it with the Sixers. So many teams had guys in and out of the lineup that teams that were healthy were able to take advantage of that and win a bunch of games. And I think not to take anything away from the Wizards, because what they did was incredible, and they played some really good basketball. But I think they've also taken advantage of a lot of other teams who have maybe been down on their luck with injuries or COVID or what have you. So I think that's a part of it as well. And I think, but I kind of think they are who they are. I think they are like they were like an 8 seed kind of team. They look for most of the year they look like a 10 seed or an 11 seed. They didn't look like they looked like a lottery team for most of the season. But I think the second half of the season was more who they are. Like like a 7 or an 8 seed. And I think like if you're looking at that Boston game and why they lost, I would say a couple things. I don't think Bradley Beal looked right. I thought he looked a lot better against Indiana. Russell Westbrook just didn't play well in that Boston game. I thought Brad Stevens, they had a good strategy to defend him very well. And it was a tough matchup for him. And he did not, and he just frankly did not play well. And then I thought defensively, I think, the Boston Celtics have had their struggles 100% on the defensive floor, defensive end of the floor all year long, but they're better than the Pacers. And they also had Jason Tatum, who went for 50 points. That was also a big part of why the Celtics won the game. You really saw him kind of take that game over in the third quarter after it was close at halftime. So I just think, in a one-game scenario, in a tournament scenario, that's kind of the only way I felt like the Celtics were going to beat them, is if Tatum went off. And I think that's what happened. And I think last night you just saw the Wizards were a better team than the Pacers last night. And it's a game-to-game thing when you're talking about that. And that's why basketball plays best of 7 series, because on any given night, a team can lose.
Paul, the Wizards would win the series if
a major injury happens to the Sixers. That's the only way I see the Wizards possibly winning the series. I just don't think it's a good enough basketball team. And I think the Sixers are, and I think we talked about this before, Mike, there's definitely like a slight against them as a 1 seed, which is weird. I don't know if it's like an apathy thing where it's like, the regular season doesn't matter. And so whatever, they're the 1 seed, it doesn't matter. Or if it's just, this social media world we live in where we're all reacting to what we see immediately. And, the Wizards won a game last night, so they're good. I don't know what it is, but it's a weird thing where the Sixers, I feel like, are kind of getting slighted, but I would be surprised if this series goes, beyond 5 games. I really would.
So Paul's official pick is?
I'll say Sixers in 5.
Sixers in 5. That matches what I have as well. Sixers in 5. The one thing about the Wizards is, I would rather have played the Pacers for the reason is stars win. They have 2 of them. You can't deny that, but they are very thin after those 2 guys. And I think Philadelphia just has better stars. I mean, Beal's a better scorer. He's not a better complete player than what Philly has. And obviously, Westbrook is what he is. But we were just talking about this yesterday on the show with Todd, Paul, which was Westbrook feels like that guy that gets all these stats, but almost does he care if he wins or loses? I don't know. He's a very competitive guy, but he just seems to be on these teams that are just kind of and maybe that's not his fault. Maybe he's on teams that just don't have the talent, but he's when it's all said and done, when you write his legacy, it's going to be a weird one to write for Russell Westbrook, a guy who's made history but hasn't won a whole heck of a lot. He hasn't been on like really bad teams, but you put him on a team with Harden, that didn't work. You put him on this team with Beal, and we'll find out. So the Westbrook story will be an interesting one when it's all said and done.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's a first ballot Hall of Famer just because of the numbers, the history, of the game. I think he has to be a Hall of Famer. It's funny, Mike, because I would say like earlier in his career when he was actually like winning games in Oklahoma City, that's when I kind of didn't. I think I had like it's almost like I feel the same way about LeBron. Is like certain stages of their career, I really didn't like them, and then I did like them. And I liked for Westbrook. For me, it was like earlier in his career when he was with OKC, I really liked his game. I loved him and Durant together. They did go to the finals. They lost to that Heat, that ridiculous Heat team for one of their championship wins. So, tough deal. But I do think that team was really good. I think he played really good basketball for them. As you mentioned, the Houston thing with Harden, it just didn't work out. I think most of us kind of saw that coming, that it wasn't going to work out. And in this Washington thing, I mean, he got traded to a bad team. I mean, quite frankly, I mean, he got traded to a team that has Bradley Beal and a bunch of guys. I mean, like that's just the bottom line there. So, but I think this run, this recent run, I think has shown you who Russell Westbrook really is to me. Because I did love, you saw Scott Brooks came out and said after the game that Westbrook gave a speech and he said, "I'm not missing the playoffs this year." And they didn't. So like stuff like that, I think he is a competitor, and I think he's a competitor for the right reasons. I think he just wants to win. I really do believe that. I know people talk about the stat padding. I do think to an extent maybe there is some of that, but I ultimately think this guy does want to win, and I think he genuinely would have been in a bad place if they had not. And I think he's the biggest reason why they turned their season around. I think you can't deny that when you look back at the year they had.
All right, Paul Hudrick, 97.3 ESPN.com. He'll have plenty of coverage of the Sixers playoffs. It all begins on Sunday, 1 o'clock here on 97.3 ESPN. Tom McGinnis will have the call. It is a Sunday, Wednesday, so a little time off there between games for the Sixers and the Wizards, and you can hear the entire series here on 97.3 ESPN. All right, Paul, have a great weekend, man.
You as well, man. Thank you.